It's mentally challenging. It beats me down on my body, but it's a problem that more people can solve. More people can run a faster marathon than can run a sub 4-minute mile, right? So in my world, I really prefer that people focus on the speed first. So in our training plans, the marathon is broken down into two 12-week segments. In the first 12 weeks, we actually train you to a half. We have you focus on some faster paces, building up your speed and strength to run a really solid half marathon. Then we take that fitness and then we transition it to the longer distance. Because when it comes right down to it, start adding up those miles, you can't also get speed on top of it. You can't start running 18, 20, 22 miles and also do tempo runs or speed runs and expect your body to be able to absorb all of it. It simply can't. So in our world, we build that fast and we put far on top of that fast. Okay? Let's see. There's another question from Charles. Charles asks, what's the best strategy for a downhill race? This gets a little bit to the pacing issue I mentioned before. In a downhill race, obviously, it's going to change up a little bit in terms of how you pace yourself overall. Downhill race is quote-unquote easier from a pacing perspective, but it's still hard on your body. And heck, at the end of the day, it's still 26.2 miles. No one's given you that finishing medal, right? You got to earn it. So from a pacing perspective, I still encourage you to be conservative on the front end of that race because it is 26.2 miles. With a downhill race, I tell people you really want to focus on your cadence. A lot of people, when they start running downhill, especially as they fatigue over the course of 26 miles, their stride length starts to get longer because it can, because downhill you got a little bit of momentum. And each extra long step ends up putting more impact. It's a lot more strain on your muscles, your quads. So people who run Boston feel great. Everyone comes through Boston halfway with a PR pace. Very few sustain that to the end when the hills come in because their quads are just shelled from those first 13 miles of running downhill. So you want to train on a lot of downhills on your own, for sure. But in a pacing perspective, I still encourage you to be smart. If anything, you've got those last 8 miles to really pick up the pace and do well, and you can do it. As an anecdote for myself, I tried and ran a sub 3-hour marathon this past October, and I followed the same guidance: easy for the first 6, steady. And as you know, we all get into a place where we can't do mental math at some point. You don't know where you are on the course relative to the finish. But I ended up figuring out that by mile 18, I thought I was totally safe. I even stopped and took a pee. But by the time I hit mile 24, I remembered there was a 0.2 involved in the race, and I needed to really start hustling. And I was able to do it. I made it by the hair on my chinny chin chin because it was a big stretch goal for me. I think by like 18 seconds or something to that effect. But the point being, I had the physical capacity to match the mental challenge I was giving myself. I wasn't in a point where I was just laying on the side of the road in a box. So important. Let's see here. Angela asks, I was wondering if you consider adjusting pace for the hills as important as slower pacing to start. I do, and I mentioned that later in the presentation before you asked your question, but I absolutely do. You may want to run 9-minute miles for your day, but if somebody puts a 2-mile hill in the middle of the race, trying to run 9-minute miles up that hill is really going to hurt you. Instead, ease off a little bit, slow down, let everyone else bury themselves on that hill. Be smart, keep your heart rate down, and run a little faster on the descent because you're going to be able to because you're not as fatigued. Remember, we're betting with the house here. We're saying long-term strategy over 26.2 miles means the steadier I can be over the entire race is better than being faster right here at this mile 8 hill. No one get out awards at mile 8 for that hill, although plenty of people apparently are competing to be to the first to the top of it. That does not going to affect you positively for the end of your race. Edward asks, how many 20-mile runs should I plan on during my training? Edward, great question. And again, I'll give you my personal bias here inside Marathon Nation. We focus more on time than we do on the miles. I don't encourage people to run any longer than 2 hours, 2.5 hours, if they can, if you're a faster runner, or 3 hours if you're on the slower side. And so if that means 20 miles for you, great. But if it means 18 miles for you, that's also fine, noting that anything longer than 3 hours really puts a serious toll on our body, unless you're including walking breaks. So in terms of how many of those long runs, depends what ability level you are and what fitness you bring to the table. At a minimum 2, maximum 4. But remember, what we do inside the house is we take those 20-mile runs, those longer runs, and I make them really hard. There's a lot of half marathon paced effort running in there. So even though you're quote unquote just running 2.5 hours, running an hour or an hour and 20 minutes of that at half marathon pace, that's nothing like the old school long runs where you just went out and ran easy for 18 miles or 20 miles. You're actually doing some serious work, and you can basically achieve the same level of stress or fatigue in your body without having to just simply rack up more miles and more miles and more miles. It's a game-changing thought for a lot of people. I know it's going to be hard for some people to digest, but got to put that out there. Brian asks, should the long run be done on a consistent day? I say absolutely. If it's a weekend day, as you suggest, Saturday or Sunday, fine. Your body certainly doesn't magically reset every Monday, but it does benefit from having as much time as possible between those long runs. And the more consistent you can be with your training overall in terms of a rhythm, the better your body will adapt to it. So yes, do your best to be as consistent as you can with them. And don't just budget time for the run itself, but also budget time for recovery. Nothing worse than coming back from a long run and having to go right out and shop or mow the lawn or something else. Factor in a little bit of time to recover as well. That's huge. Let's see here. Tony asks, let me scroll down here. Tony's asking about the download. I'll have to check through that, Tony. Tony says some of the calculations aren't working. I'll go through and check that for you as well and see if the calculations are not working. That sheet should be okay, but I'll see. You can also email me, Tony, at patrick@marathonnation.us, and I can email you the sheet, see if that works as well. Thomas asks, I've run 6 marathons the last 3 trying to qualify for Boston. I came close, but just short. 1 minute, 21 seconds in the last race. Wow, that's so close. First of all, points to you for shooting for that goal and getting so close. How can I beat the last 6 miles? Part of it, Thomas, as I mentioned here, is the first 6 miles. How smart can you be in those first 6 miles? Chances are you've been running aggressively. Because running for Boston means you're running a solid time. And you might be running that aggressive pace right out of the gate. By the time you hit the last 6 miles, it's a little too much. Consider some of your longer runs going a little easier for those first 6 miles or building up to that steady pace, and then running slightly faster. So if your BQ time is 8:45s, try running 9s or 9:15s in the beginning, then dial it into like 8:40s and sit on that for a while and see how that feels. Note your paces, note the heart rate data, do that in a race simulation run and see how it goes. Guaranteed you're going to do well there. Now, there's a variety of other training things we can get into, but from a race execution and pacing standpoint, definitely look at those first couple miles. Okay. Tony's asking again. Okay. All right, yes. Okay, so Tony wants to know if the VDOT, entering that VDOT in that space actually affects the calculations. No, Tony, it doesn't. In that sheet, it does. If you're a member inside our house, you get the VDOT, then we'll justify your paces and we'll personalize them into your training plan. But in that spreadsheet, it's just for tracking purposes. It's the actual time from the 5K test that dedicates the paces. Okay. Steve had asked about the 10K being a better indicator of your pace because it's a longer run. Absolutely, the 10K is a better indicator, but like I said, it punches a big hole in your training. Alexander followed up by saying, wouldn't the 5K give you a better VDOT, resulting in more intense training? Yes, so the 5K run does give you a better VDOT, and that's a great question, and I really debated whether or not to put that in this presentation. Alexander's point is basically this. You test a 5K, but you're training for a marathon. The 5K VDOT's a little fast based on what you're going to run in a marathon, so I'm training to this faster number, but I run slower on race day. What's up with that? Well, again, a lot of people can train to that fast number, and if you're starting with our plans, 24 weeks out, we build you to a half marathon first, you may not be able to run that half marathon at that 5K VDOT time, but you could be pretty close after 12 weeks of training. And by the time you get into the last 12 weeks of race prep training, you might even be even closer. So I understand that there's going to be some fudge factor with that 5K number, but I prefer to stress the training, stress you in the training, than give you an easy hall pass right out of the gate. Because a lot of the workouts are 3 by 1 mile, 6 by half mile, a lot of intervals in our house. Though a lot of people can overachieve at the shorter stuff, but they fail later on. Last thing I want to do is have you run an easier pace on those shorter intervals because it's more appropriate for what you're going to do in 12 weeks. So we have that factored in. But it is certainly something to be wary of. So thank you for bringing that up, Alexander. Philip asks, He's 49 and run 17 marathons. Man, that's huge, Philip. Congratulations. And I always cramp the last 5 to 6 miles. I've tried everything, but I never cramp in training. What about electrolyte like Elite? I would definitely check into electrolytes. Very interesting. I wonder what you've done differently on race day that leads to that cramping. Sodium is just one thing you can do to take care of cramping. I consider cramps to basically be your body's way of saying, hey, what you're doing to me right now, I'm not so jiggy with it. I want you to slow down. I'm going to throw this cramp in your way so you can't keep running at this effort. You want to take a look at your nutrition strategy, what you're doing both in the 2 or 3 days leading up to the race, but also what you're doing race breakfast, and then in the beginning miles.